This review was written from the perspective of someone who saw Fate Zero before seeing Fate Stay Night and thought that it was kinda meh. While the first half of this video will focus on my thoughts in general on the series, the second half will go more in depth and look at Fate Stay Night as it compares to Fate Zero. Now let's get going. Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works is the sequel to 2011's Fate Zero, as well as an attempt to make everybody forget about 2006's Fate Stay Night, which 9 out of 10 dentists agree was harder to watch than a bunny getting dumped in a blender. Not that I would know anything about that. Moving on. Basically, 7 people summon 7 spirits from history and fight it out for a magical wish-granting artifact called the Holy Grail. And that sounds pretty simple, but trust me when I say that this show will spend all the fucking time in the world trying to convince you that it isn't. But we'll get to that later, because the first thing pretty much anybody is going to notice is that this show is beyond gorgeous. Ufotable is kind of like the Beyonce of anime studios. You don't have to like what they do, but you kind of have to respect that they always look good doing it. And it's not just the action or the sweeping vistas, it's the little things, like dust passing through beams of light in an old building, or people's reflections in shined floors, or the amount of detail put into set dressing. Like, this orange looks better than any orange I've ever seen in my entire life. And yeah, there's some ugly CG here and there, but honestly, even the CG generally looks better than average. And the soundtrack is just as good as the visuals, if a bit more subtle. There are actually long stretches where there's no music at all, and it does a great job of selling those tense moments. But when the soundtrack is there, it sounds absolutely magnificent and does a great job of complementing what's happening on screen. Unfortunately, the same amount of care didn't go into crafting these characters. The leads here are Rin and Shiro, and as far as main characters go, these two are about as bare bones as it gets. Shiro is your standard shonen hero. He's aloof, kinda dumb, always down to help people, and most importantly, he believes in himself. He also never really grows or learns anything, and as a result, he's pretty boring. And Rin doesn't really come off much better, since she's basically just tsundere jailbait. And while I found both of them pretty annoying at first, as things got going it becomes clear that they exist less to be actual characters and more just to advance the plot. There's also an obligatory romantic subplot, but thankfully it's kept pretty short. With characters like these, there's always that temptation to stretch out the will they or won't they phase for as long as humanly possible, but Fate Stay Night does a good job of making their relationship progression feel natural, and there were very few times where I felt like it was actually slowing things down, even if all the blushing was a bit annoying. Most of the other characters are just as paint by numbers, and even the other masters don't get very well developed. The only 2 characters I ever felt any real attachment to were Castor and Elia, for reasons that I can't go into to avoid spoilers. But honestly, the vast majority of characters here are just flat and uninteresting. And it's not just that they're uninteresting, there's not much subtlety either. It's like the only way we're supposed to be able to tell that a guy is actually evil is if he's trying to destroy the world or is actively molesting someone. And that's not even counting the characters who just straight up disappear and are never seen again. Still, when the show's at its best, none of this really matters. The plot is genuinely interesting, even if the characters aren't, and the action is truly spectacular. Nah, Fate Stay Night's biggest problem is its pacing. The first 2 episodes, which are 40 minutes each by the way, are some of the slowest moving, least interesting setups I have ever seen. And when episode 3 comes along and it's this ridiculously awesome action fest, you start thinking, okay, so this is where things start to get interesting. But nope, because right after that you get an entire episode dedicated to touring a fucking high school. And this pacing problem isn't a series-wide thing. At around episode 5, it finds its footing and stays pretty on point for the entire rest of the show. But to get to that point, you have to sit through so much slow-ass dialogue that it's practically torture, including a scene where 3 people sit in a church for literally 10 uninterrupted minutes, explaining rules that should have been spelled out in the first 80 minutes of introduction that came before it. But aside from what I've already mentioned, there's really not all that much to hate here. Towards the end, there are a few plot conveniences that some people will find more annoying than others, but at the end of the day, Fate Stay Night makes for a pretty decent action series, as long as you're willing to tolerate a slow start and some bland characters. The last thing I'll say before I get into comparisons is that you don't really need to have seen Fate Zero to enjoy Fate Stay Night. Things start off a bit confusing if you don't know the basic setup, but all of the exposition does help with getting you oriented. What I will say is that a few characters, particularly Ilya and Kiritsugu, are made much more interesting by having seen Fate Zero. but they're not all that important, so whether or not that's important to you is a matter of preference. Anyway, that about does it for my thoughts on Fate Stay Night as a standalone series. If you're interested in hearing how it compares to Fate Zero, then just stay tuned.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
Nya 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 nya. I made you eat your parents. Nya 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 nya.
My mom and dad are dead! No! No!
So I'm just gonna get this out of the way. I wasn't a huge fan of Fate Zero. That's not to say that I thought it was awful, I just felt that it was mostly wasted potential. And part of what makes comparing these two series so interesting is the fact that they're basically polar opposites, even though it's the same studio and the same source material. Like the characters, for instance. Fate Zero's character roster was all over the place. Everybody was unique and had reasonable motivations, and aside from these two, you'd have a hard time calling anyone out as straight up good or evil. And that contrasts pretty heavily with Fate Stay Night, where all the characters are very much either good or evil. Shiro isn't Kuritsugu. He isn't conflicted, he doesn't have to make the hard decisions, he's the good guy, and he always does the right thing. And this is true of the villains too. You're not meant to sympathize with these people because, with the exception of Castor and Elia, they aren't really people. They're just assholes who do evil things because they're bad, and that's all that matters. Returning characters get similar treatment as well. Gilgamesh isn't the same arrogant but likable god king from Fate Zero. This guy is very much a typical anime villain, with no redeeming qualities and a plan so cliche I almost thought he was joking. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have a clear distinction between your heroes and your villains. It's just jarring when Fate Zero operated almost exclusively in shades of grey, while Fate Stay Night colors everything as either black or white. Another big difference is in the action. Fate Stay Night's action is extremely kinetic and interesting, while Fate Zero is often just wasn't. A big problem I had with Fate Zero was how it handled fights between characters, because it pretty much always boiled down to, here's my ultimate power, oh well here's my ultimate power, it happens to be yours, so G fucking G. Like most of the time when two servants went up against each other, you already knew who was gonna win, because the person who used their noble phantasm first was pretty much always gonna get screwed. And while Fate Zero got some pretty cinematic moments with this formula, I found Fate Stay Night does a much better job of making fights feel meaningful. Because of how well the plot plays out, there were a lot of times where I was genuinely unsure of who was gonna win. It seems like they also tried to make Saber more interesting, since now she's a lot less overpowered than she was before. And they don't just give her a new ability every time she's faced with a problem like they did in Fate Zero. And that makes her a lot less annoying as a main character, because something that really bugs me about her in the first series was how they just kept slapping power-ups on her every few episodes whenever the situation demanded it. Like how she can just suddenly walk on water, or how she was immune to magic, or this scene here where she can just randomly ghost ride her motorcycle. The third major difference between the two would probably be the setting. In Fate Zero, the Holy Grail War was this huge deal. The masters came from all around the world, and the people were so desperate to win they were kidnapping children and mutilating themselves. Whereas in Fate Stay Night, every contestant lives within walking distance of each other, and most of them are high schoolers. And that's a pretty weird change considering the fate of the entire world hangs in the balance. It's almost like everybody just stopped giving a crap in the 5 years between the series. I mean, Shiro summoned Saber by accident. Like, so few people are going for this that Shiro can just get in by default. And this retard can barely even do magic, but for some reason he's just as qualified as people whose entire lives have been dedicated to learning it. Like, I don't have an inherent problem with the high school setting, other than that it's kind of a cliche, but it just doesn't make any sense here. During a battle, the entire population of the school gets taken away in ambulances, but the next day they just show up again like nothing happened. It kind of reminds me of Future Diary, in that the conflict that's being presented here doesn't really need to be associated with this setting, and as a viewer you really need to suspend your disbelief to accommodate it being here at all. The last direct comparison I want to make is about the tone. Fate Zero was very dark and serious, and held itself up as this intense series. Fate Stay Night is in a weird position where it's kinda caught in the middle. Most of the series is much more lighthearted. I mean, bad things happen, but everything usually just kinda works out. But the entire Fate series was originally written by Gen Urobuchi, and his trademark soul-crushing style still carries over in a few instances. This scene in particular does a great job of impressing the awfulness of Saber's situation on the viewer, and I think it's this kind of imagery that best showcases the Urobuchi's influence on Fate Stay Night. Overall, I'd say despite how different the two series are, they're both pretty comparable in terms of quality. But how disparate they are makes that a very subjective answer, and I'm sure most people will probably fall much more heavily towards one or the other. I personally enjoyed Fate Stay Night more than Fate Zero, but that's just me. I guess that pretty much wraps Yeah, so thanks for watching. If you have any interest in checking out Fate Stay Night or Fate Zero, you can find them over at crunchyroll.com. And if you have any thoughts on my video, I'd be glad to hear about them in the comments below. See you next time.